Good afternoon, Stony Hill. I hope everyone is having a great week. Over the next couple weeks, as we remain unable to meet in person together, myself or someone will be recording a brief midweek video in an effort to reflect upon the main points of the sermon from the previous Sunday, which will keep our minds focused on God's Word and meditating on His truth. So I'm going to take a few minutes now to reflect on Psalm 13 and the theme of lament that Pastor Jeff preached on this past Sunday. I hope it's helpful, and thank you for watching. On this past Sunday, Pastor Jeff took us through Psalm 13 and the theme of lament. It was a very applicable and helpful sermon for our current times, especially as we look around the world and see the virus attacking so many. And we even see within our own congregation those who are sick with things that are not the coronavirus, that are, of course, put in further harm because of it. Those who are having economic difficulties, whether that's a job loss or hurting business. And so we are in a time in which many people are struggling. And so the theme of lament and the idea of Psalm chapter 13 is incredibly helpful in this time. In the sermon, Pastor Jeff referenced a book by Mark Vergrope, I hope I said his name right, probably didn't, called Dark Clouds, Deep Mercy. It's a very good book. I have to admit I have not read the whole thing yet. I've read parts of it. I've seen many interviews with the author and been very helped by them. And looking forward now, especially as it was briefly mentioned in the sermon, to reading it soon. He defines lament as a prayer in pain that leads to trust. A prayer in pain that leads to trust. And looking at Psalm 13, Pastor Jeff led us to 3 points. Number 1 was express your sorrow. Express your sorrow to God. Right, as David was writing this psalm, he hadn't sinned. He was in a difficult position. In the Psalms in which David does sin, of course we think of Psalm 51 as one of them, he immediately repents of his sin. And he speaks in the psalm of repenting of his sin, for it was his sin that brought this calamity upon him. But in Psalm 13, he starts with these questions. He says, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" I'm reminded of a comparable lament psalm, Psalm 77, verses 7 through 9, that ask these questions. It says, "Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favorable? Has his steadfast love forever ceased? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious?" Now, you and I know, of course, if we were sitting in a Bible study or in a Sunday school class and we began our prayer with, "God, have you forgotten to be gracious? God, has your steadfast love ceased?" Things would get a little weird. We'd be surprised, right? Because theologically, in our minds, from what we know of the Scriptures, we know that God's steadfast love hasn't ceased. We know his steadfast love endures forever. We know he has not forgotten to be gracious. And so lament, this theme of lament, this idea of lament that we see throughout the Psalms, the book of Lamentations, is the idea that we know God's character. We know on the one hand he's gracious, he's compassionate, he's full of steadfast love. When we think of David, right, he won't let the wicked prevail indefinitely over his people. But we lament when we look out the world and we see the opposite. It seems as if God is not gracious. It seems as if his steadfast love has run out. As we express our sorrows, as we express the times when it's difficult to trust in the Lord, difficult to be reminded of his graciousness, when we feel as if he's forgotten us, it's helpful to remember, what is the goal of lament? Where is lament meant to lead? Remember, lament is a prayer in pain that leads to trust, right? We cry out to God. We've talked already about a few of these questions from the beginning of Psalm 13 and the beginning of Psalm 77, right? And these questions are questions we know theologically. Again, we know theologically the answer. We know that God hasn't forgotten his people. We know that God is gracious. We know that his steadfast love endures forever. So why are they asking the question? Well, they're asking the question because they're in pain, right? When you are genuinely in pain and the world, what you see, doesn't match up with what you know of God's character, you cry out in pain. But the beauty of what we see in Psalm 13, the beauty of lament, is that in the end, the circumstances might not change. Right? Today we're still, many of us still stuck in our homes. Many of the impacts of the coronavirus on people's health, even just outside of just the virus, but the difficulty it is to get elective surgeries and other health needs, along with financial impact on many. These things aren't gone yet, right? In many ways, God hasn't changed our circumstances, and they still might not be changed for a few weeks and even months. Who knows? But the beauty of lament is that it's a prayer in pain. It doesn't stay in pain, right? David begins this prayer, right, wondering, having trouble trusting in the Lord. But in the end, the lament leads you to trust in God, even in the midst of difficult circumstances. Let me read verses 5 and 6 of Psalm 13. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. See, between those first few verses and these last verses, not a lot has changed, right? It's only 4 verses. You sat down to write it, things wouldn't change that much. But it's a prayer in pain that leads to trust. We cry out to God, and we're reminded in crying out to him. That's right. God is gracious. He hasn't forgotten to be gracious. He hasn't forgotten about David, right? A man after God's own heart. We might think a man after God's own heart asking, how long will you forget me forever? Well, of course the Lord hasn't forgotten him. And when we are in these moments of pain and struggle, and we cry out to the Lord, it's okay to be honest. The Lord knows how you're feeling. Again, this is the language, as Mark Rogop says in his book, this is the language of people who trust in God's sovereignty while living in a world of tragedy. We know God is sovereign. We know that he knows, right? You're not fooling the Lord by not honestly calling out and praying to him. But in doing so, in our times in which we're not trusting in the Lord, in which it's difficult to trust in the Lord because of our circumstances, let us cry out to God. Let us cry out to him in the midst of sorrows, in the midst of difficult times, and let that prayer of pain lead us to greater trust in him. And I pray this week that you would read back through Psalm chapter 13. I suggest as well Psalm maybe 22, 44, 77. Those are all lament psalms in which we see God's people crying out to him, crying out with questions that our sort of theological understanding bristles against a little bit. But in those psalms, we see God's people being led from this prayer in pain in difficult times, and even without circumstances changing, being led to trust in him more fully. And I pray that that is what we see in our lives, and I'm praying for you, and I hope you're having a great week. Thank you.